This week, we welcome to the show the one and only Dr. Martin Shaw. Now, Martin, I do this thing where I introduce people now and get them to correct me as to stuff that I've missed out or got wrong to begin with. So I've written yours out. Dr. Martin Shaw is a poet, storyteller, teacher, and mythologist. I want to play with that word, and founder of the West Country School of Myth. He is the author of numerous books, including the recently released Bardskull. So good, bad, 80%? How is that for an intro?
Very good. I think, ironically, the problem is probably in the very first word is poet, because
Yeah.
it's a funny thing. Although I would say I'm alive to a certain type of poetic, well, actually, what James Hillman used to call the poetic basis of mind. I always fall short of calling myself a poet, but I don't. It's not unenjoyable when someone else says it. Seamus Heaney always said that a poet it's such a praise word that you have to be terribly careful about giving it to yourself. And this is Heaney. This is a
I
huge
mean, what
figure.
did he know about poetry? Yeah.
I think actually, I mean, with Heaney, I love his poems, but actually, I just think as a sort of a cultural imprint after Yeats in Ireland, they desperately needed him, and Kavanagh too, in a different type of way. But anyway, sorry, I'm going in a different direction. But no, other than
Well,
that, it
Yates is going
sounds
to come up in our
fine.
discussion.
And
Yeah.
tell me about the mythologist query.
Well, so Bardskull is I wrote this out because I want to see if you like these. We were just talking before we hit record that it got a write up in the Sunday Times, which is excellent. But did they say, because I read this book in actually quite the last two books of yours I've read have been in geographically unusual situations. So Courting the Wild Twin, I believe I mentioned, I picked up on the way to the southwest coast of Tasmania, which is Gondwana survival forests. There's nothing around. Like, it's the edge of the world. The entrance to Macquarie Harbour is called Hell's Gate, and when you get there in the boat, and it's this huge volume of water going out into the Southern Ocean and nothing. It's incredible, right? So it was a really odd place to do it. And this time I was reading Bardskull in New Zealand, which I thought was just going to be an innocuous trip for my friend's wedding. But cyclones, earthquakes,
Oh,
the sort of things New Zealand does. So it was quite good. And I've been sitting with Bardskull and how to describe it in a pithy, borderline annoying way, but I think might help for listeners. And I've got a couple of them. And this is coming back to you, what's wrong with mythologist as a word, right? Uh, it's C.G. Jung's Red Book meets A Field in England. And I've also got Italo Calvino does Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, right?
That's the one. That's the one. Yeah.
Yeah, because this is coming back to mythology, myths, and some of the denatured terms. Not that myth is necessarily denatured, but um, to some extent, who's anyone in possession of a human mind is some kind of mythologist, right? So that's kind of where, are we using the right words when we talk about these beings? And I really enjoyed, there's an encounter in Bardskull, and let me bring it up, when we talk about myth and story, that Merlin says, coming up to me now, archetype as depleted language. So Merlin told you not to call him an archetype because that's depleted language. So maybe we start there. So what's going on with archetype as depleted language?
Yeah. I think the awful thing is when you start to name the gods as archetypes, you've immediately sort of thinned them into facsimiles where, well, if and we say with a knowing wink, well, of course, Baba Yaga is Kali, and Kali is blah blah blah. This is desperately dangerous, foolish terrain to start sticking everybody in the same cauldron. So I knew early on through my time as a wilderness rites of passage guide that there are energies out there in the bush that are far more than metaphor. And so, you learn very quickly to keep your, to doff your hat. And so, Yeah, I've always found the thing about archetype is it doesn't have an image. There's no image attached to it. So my soul can't receive it because it doesn't know what it's looking at. It's an abstraction for me. It's a sort of strangulated, useful term in its way. It does have use, and I can immediately make associations with it. But when I was a rookie writer, I've written 17 books now, but my first few books, I was trying to figure out, as all writers do, how do I write? And gradually I was trying to comb the academy out of what I was doing. And words like archetype for me, they stick in the craw, especially as an oral storyteller.
Mm. So, do you think, here's a weird way of saying it, do you think that's Jung's fault, or do you think it's the lesser minds that came after him?
I think
Because he did a lot of good stuff that, do you know what I mean? Like, I absolutely am in complete resonance with that. And I just, whenever I go back to reading Jung, I realize how, in the best possible way, how crazy he was, like building towers and living as a polygamist and, you know, kind of walking the walk. And I just wonder, has his acolytes denatured it, or was the word
yeah,
useful if not true to begin with?
I think I prefer the word primordial.
Mm-hmm.
I like primordial. It just feels better in my mouth. But I no, I do you remember you will know this quote from Jung. He said, "There's one thing in the world I wouldn't want to be. It's a Jungian."
Yeah.
And so he saw down the trail. I think there's very few that have come anywhere near the sheer scale and kind of reckless, wonderful ambition of Jung in the mid to late part of the 20th century. He's extraordinary. Like you, I don't go back to him a lot, but when I do, it's a jaw-dropping encounter, the sheer scale of the thing. And actually, I mean, what people forget, you will know this, is it really is down to Jung that an enormous amount of alchemical material has been made accessible. And really his great devotee Marie Louise von Franz doing her work, we all owe him a tremendous debt, even if Jung was dealing he was putting he was putting his stick in big medicine, and he was dealing with wild animals. And of course, Jungianism these days at its worst, and it's by no means not all like that. You're dealing with a pelt, not an animal. And as soon as
Yes.
you're dealing
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
as soon as you're dealing with something that is no longer dangerous, you can have naive, nostalgic thoughts about it. But I don't feel Jung as a nostalgic energy. I still feel that Jung is talking about something in the future that we haven't encountered yet.
Yeah. So I'm glad you said it that way, because again, thinking about the denaturing, or the decoloring as well of the word archetype. I pulled a quote. I cherry pick and store away, squirrel away Bayo Komalafe quotes after doing a couple of his courses. But at the end of last year, it was about October, he wrote, because he did study psychology. When he came on the show, he said, "Yes, I've come through the psychological industrial complex," and that's excellent. Right? But I have felt the need to say more about the colonial dynamics at work within the discipline of psychology, how it manufactures its object of analysis, how it is value laden and culturally composed, instead of being, as is often presumed, an epistemologically superior glimpse of the true nature of the psyche, and how it is entangled with the politics of sameness and control. To that last point, a dear colleague of mine and professor emerita of psychology goes so far as to suggest that psychology is the policeman of capitalism, which there's just 20 things in every one of his paragraphs. But that idea, and this is, I think, what Merlin was saying to you, we will get back to explaining Bardskull in its own way eventually. But we're following Merlin with this, that's exactly right. When you encounter these forms, we reach for something that has given itself the presumption of epistemological superiority. So you have an encounter with Merlin, and it's like, oh, archetypes. That's what that was, and
Mm.
it's too small. But I thought I'd share that. What do you think?
I think it's terrific. I like it. I like it. And I think this is along the track you're referring to. I've always liked the notion of, eros in one hand and rigor in the other. That you can, as something Hillman used to say, we forget that the brain is filled with blood. And really wonderful, sharp, angular, strange, intellectual thinking can do. It's like a form of electricity on occasion. It's certainly, a high magic. Uh, but I also know that it can sort of tie us up in the most sort of terrifying of knots. And I also, one of the things I suppose I come back to is I've spent thousands and thousands of nights outdoors. Like I don't know, I've just slept and lived outdoors a lot. And I know that that kind of language is unattractive to a forest.
Yes.
It's just
Yeah.
unattractive. It's tremendously unsexy. There's no courtship in it.
No.
Suddenly you're looking at an old growth oak forest as a piece of two by four. So I suppose
Yeah.
actually Um, I choose my language carefully, and I used, that encounter with Merlin was very real. But I remember even as I was scribbling it down in my journal in the rain on the bank of the river where it happened, um, it was a great lesson in how you introduce yourself to a place. And language being like precious red beads that fall from your mouth. You've got to be careful with them.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So this biographical information, I assume that I encountered reading Bardskull that I want to pick up on, but I wanted to start with Merlin and then go back to the traditional first question because we picked some stuff out there, Martin. But were you a weird kid?
I was. I was and remain a profoundly weird adult and getting weirder by the second. Uh, I think what was very useful about my childhood was simply by us not having much money. I grew up in a house where I had to do a lot of imagining for myself. We didn't have a telly. We didn't have a car, so a lot of terrain around the house was negotiated by foot. Um, didn't have a telephone. So I was sort of back to my own resources, back to the books on the shelves, back to the fact that although I lived on a small housing estate, behind that estate was a reasonably sized chunk of forest. And whilst I would go to church on a Sunday, I knew that whilst I couldn't connect with anything particularly vital in the pulpit, as soon as I got home, I only had to stand in the back garden at dusk and feel the wind moving through the forest or watching the berries fall over the trees into the long grasses to know I was in a different type of body of Christ. I was into something else, but I had no language for that. I was a weird kid. I was the kid at the edge of the playground who was desperately sort of ill-fitted inside his own body. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. The church thing's interesting, right? Because there's a passing reference to a Christian convention, I think in Wales
Yeah,
or
yeah,
something.
yeah.
So you were was that something you were kind of your experience of Christianity as a kid, was that, do you look at it now and think, well, that's me seeking, or is that just sort of landed on you and you just kept going until you adulted enough to go, actually, I don't want to do this anymore? What was that? Because that's quite in. That's not just
Yeah.
swinging by the church on a Sunday or at Easter.
No, no, and I mean, it would be part of a Christian movement you will know about, and I would imagine are sort of interested in a way. It's the charismatic movement. So
Mhm.
that was high drama when the charismatic movement came along, and extraordinary things were happening in the middle of church services. Gifts of tongue, healings, all sorts of things going on. Yeah, I was part of that because that was part of my family's cultural life at that time. But even that, I did appreciate the vivacity of the Holy Spirit. It was fun to be like, oh, wow, shit is happening. Shit is really happening. Even so, by the time I was 17, I knew that I was going to be sort of entering on some other kind of journey. Off I went. Ironically, now at 51, I am a Christian. and about to enter, and the least woolly part of the Christian spectrum you can possibly get near, which is Eastern Orthodoxy. So
Yeah, sure.
on Easter Day Julian calendar, April 16th, I'll be received into the Eastern Orthodox Church. And ironically and weirdly, none of that could have happened without Bardskull, which does not seem to be pointing in that kind of direction to me anyway, as I was writing it.
It's obviously when you just told me that, which I didn't know, in the back of my head, I'm kind of running through Bardskull going like, it's it's both unexpected and not
Yeah.
unexpected to end up there at the end of a process like that. So we'll come back to it because that's interesting. Going back to 17, then, did you, looking back now, how does one go from being that kid to published author, mythologist, founding a mythology school, and so on? Did you sort of go, right, I'm off to found a mythology school in a few decades, and I've got to work out what I'm going to do in between now and then? Was there always that sort of draw to, I guess, the mythic and writing and so on?
There was a draw to writing. I didn't know storytelling existed in the way that I do it, because I had been read to as a child in libraries and by my mum, but I didn't know there was, say, for example, the tradition of Scottish travelling storytellers who would turn up and could tell stories for many days. One hugely important thing that I now realize how crucial it was is that actually the Scottish comedian Billy Connolly toured Australia and New Zealand and made a TV show out of it in the early 90s. And there's a moment in it where he just turns to the camera and he says, and I never forgot it, he says, Lenny Henry, who's another comedian, he asked me, where do I keep on what computer disk do all my jokes and stories live? And I just tapped my head. Now, I would have only been about 20 when I saw that, but it was one of the most thrilling and exciting things I had ever seen, that there was a man on the planet that would walk out in front of thousands of people every night with no clear notion of what he was going to do other than take his imagination for a walk way out where the buses didn't park. And he was going to hope that each leap he made, he touched in on one of this great grab bag of stories he had, and that is now enormously similar to what I ended up practicing. I am in nowhere near the League of Billy Connolly as a storyteller, but the seed was there long before. Never a sense. I'm not a man with any kind of plan B, Gordon. There's no plan B for me. I'm sure there's no plan B for you, really. You're this funny little fella, not you personally, but one is a funny little fella, just trying to wander your way through these few years that we have and see if you can keep doing what it is that really gives you joy. I had enough brief experiences of things like working in video stores to know I'm terrible at this. I'm terrible at any kind of straight line thing. So I'd rather be broke. I've never ever given much economic thought to anything like that. So, in other words, no, it was very incremental. I think what happened in my 20s, I went through a divorce and difficult stuff. I began to realize that I was a complex, rather wounded man, and I rediscovered the myths and stories I loved as a child, but in a much, much deeper way. I will, as you will remember, the impact, the strange impact of the Lord of the Rings movies about 20 years ago. I remember coming back to my parents' house at Christmas, and by then I was deep into what I do now, but going into a large air conditioned cinema with 300 other very normal folk, and watching at the death of certain characters, everybody in tears in a cinema and for a major motion picture. I couldn't believe it. And I thought, gosh, I hear a lot about a meaning shaped hole or a God shaped hole, but I began to think that actually we've really got a myth shaped hole as
Yeah.
well to contemplate.
That absolutely is, yeah. My experience of it, because I read the book so young, and then I was, I think, 18 when the first one came out, whatever it was an understand. I reached a new understanding of the level of real that myth is, because it was always important to me, and then to see its reaction to other people. And I joke, but it was half true. One of the reasons I moved to New Zealand straight after university was in part because of the films. Like, why
Yeah,
not? I got to go somewhere,
there you
and I did, and it was ended up with some very unusual Lord of the Rings adventures, like being at the Embassy Theatre in Wellington the weekend that it won all the Oscars, and you just sort of dropped into resonance with it. It made myth a different kind of real, and all this sort of smoke for very good reasons that people blew in Tolkien's direction about what it was he'd uncovered or encountered and delivered, I guess, having a kind of real. I understood that a bit better after the films, because they can, anyone encountering these forms is finds medicine in them, and that's, I think, to your point, that the whole is mythological.
mm, yeah.
Yeah. So there's more biography to go, but I think, given I spoke about myth, I sort of put some brackets around mythologist at the intro, and we've landed here with a myth-shaped whole. What is the definition? And this is such a mean word and a mean question, but how does someone who founded a school of myth define myth?
Well, of course, as you can imagine, after being asked that question many hundreds of times, there are all sorts of little soundbitey and things that can pop
Yeah,
out of me. Um, I had a friend a guy called Danny Deardorff, who wrote a very interesting book, if you haven't come across it, called The Other Within, The Genius of Deformity Within Myth, Culture and Psyche. Danny had polio, so he was in a chair, greatest storyteller I ever met. But Danny would say, so I'll paraphrase Danny, he'd say, um, oh, actually, no. Or am I now quoting myself? I can't remember. I've got so old. Uh, Myth is a beautiful way of telling the truth, and I think that was what he said, or maybe I said myth is a wild way of telling the truth, or myth is a way of telling the truth without the use of facts, something like that. I mean, in Mexico, they would be calling it the river beneath the river. It would be that. Uh, Irascible push, you know, push this. It's a sort of an electrical encounter that is without the hysterical use of statistics and all the stuff that's sending us bonkers that we sort of mainline every day. There's this deeper thing. I think about myth. I often talk about it as a prayer mat. And I say the correct position for people in the universe, I suggest most of us is on our knees praying. And I think if you don't have to go far into yourself to find an old man or an old woman that is praying, they're always there. And
yeah,
myth for me is the thing that gets me in contact with that old part of myself. But, and I think you might respond to this, myths are about the future too. It's not just about a reenactment fair by the fire and me puffing on my pipe. Much as I'm very warm to those realities, I talk about ancient things because I sense they are in the future too. And
yeah,
something that I've learned through many vigils and 4 years living in a tent is that our our understanding of time itself for most is so minute and so incredibly limited. Myth seems to be a way in which I can walk through doors into different centuries. It's as if
yeah,
at the end of my garden, a certain story will open out into a medieval courtyard, and I will move through that medieval courtyard. And then suddenly I'm up in the hills of Orkney, and I keep on going, and I'm in the taiga of Siberia. And then at the very end of that journey, I might be in Papua New Guinea. It just does
yeah.
something. It just does something. So I'm sorry, that's not very glib, but that's just
It's
something.
really good. It's really good because it. I agree completely about um, our puny human understanding of time. just fails with this kind of stuff. And you get, I mean, I think of the dreaming here in Australia as it's a far more sophisticated temporal theory that allows for that original energy of creation to also still be accessible. Like our human understanding of time is something we chose to do before we got here, and it doesn't really map. And one of the ways into it, the key way in, or uh, it's populated by things that we would use myth to describe, right? So I like the atemporality in that, because the other one I throw out is that sort of Tolkien paraphrase of misdescribed things that never happen but always are, and the
Yeah.
always are allows for it to be in the future as well. Because again, you're not human time doesn't work well enough for these forms. So that's really good. I also like the inclusion of beauty because I think of indigenous systems like the beauty way, where one of the things that pulls you through the cosmos is following that line of beauty, which is mythic. I mean, it's found in the mythic, and that's yeah. So I think beautiful truth works really well there. So maybe we could smush them together with the Tolkien one. Beautiful truth, yeah, always are. It's in there. We got there in the end, but unsurprisingly, it doesn't submit to like a tweet.
No,
You can't
no,
kind of can't
no,
get it down there.
no.
All right. So living in a tent's interesting. There's a couple of other. I want to talk about place in the context of, and this is another mean word. I was thinking about this I only got back last night on the flight last night when I don't want to call Bardskull a project, but it's better to consider it a ceremony. But there were kind of intentional organizations in and around place that became part of it. So I want to get to there, but there's a few moments about, I guess, there's a few questions or thoughts around place and the more than human. But one of them was you taught in Yeats's Tower and actually read poems aloud. Tell us that story, because that's awesome. I studied Yeats at school, and we've already mentioned Seamus Heaney and so on. So I think, and towers are powerfully mythic or archetypal anyway. So yeah, tell us that story.
Oh, well, it was as wonderful as it sounds, Gordon. I was traveling across Ireland. For my first time as what you call a shamanic, like a traditional storyteller, and large part of my bloodline is over in Connaught, which is for me that's Mayo, Galway, a wee bit of Sligo, and the tour culminates unbelievably of a day's teaching and an evening in Tor Ballylee, Yeats's small but extraordinary tower in Galway County. And I've been thinking about this place has lodged in my imagination for about 19 years. I'm a great fan of A. Russell, his friend, who truly really was a mystic. They always said if A.E. and Yeats together sort of conjured a spirit or encountered a spirit, actually, Russell would sit in reverie, but Yeats would interrogate. He would interrogate. So he's that type. He's a magician in a fashion. He wants to be remembered. And anyway, I get to the tower and it's a phenomenal day. I give a workshop in his garage to about 50 people. And then what happens is suddenly it's getting dark. There's no one really around. And they just say, well, there's nowhere for you to go. You better use Yeats's bedroom as your green room for the next 3 hours. Now it's freezing cold. It's late October. There's no heating. So I just have to get into Yeats's bed, and it's all the original sheet. It's his bed, and it's not actually it's not wasn't a massively comfortable experience. The sheets are very very cold and damp, and I get in them and I have strange liminal dreams. Then I get out of the bed and I think, well, I can see out of the window that people are walking across the fields and lanterns are lit, and I'm thinking, good Lord, I hope I can summon whatever I need to summon this evening. So what I do is I start reciting Yeats poems out loud. And I have my eyes shut, but I'm going through, I will arise now and go to Innisfree. And I went to the Hazelwood because there were, fire was in my head. And I'm in the middle of it all. And I opened my eyes and right in front of me is a very large bat. It's a real bat, and it's just there, just fucking me and the bat. And I just close my eyes and continue, and then I open them again, and the bat is there. And then finally, I closed my eyes for a third time, and when I opened them, the bat has just disappeared. I can only presume there was an open fireplace, and I presume the bat came down through. And I'm not a very literal person, but that was a literal bat.
Yeah.
Came down and into the room. And so I then come down from Yates's bedroom down, and I meet an old lady in the corridor who's sort of my host for the evening. I'm about to go on, and I say, she said, I said, it's very strange. I've just been visited by a bat, and she sort of gripped my arm and said, have you seen the bat? And I thought, oh no, here we go. Here we go. Some horrific Lady Gregory-esque murder ballad is about to arrive. I'll be dead before
Yes.
before the cock has crowed. And she looked at me with a great twinkle and said, the last person to see that bat, which is Willie, our Willie, that's him. The last person to see Willie won the Nobel Peace Prize. And then squeezed me.
Mm.
As I'm talking to you now, I'm wondering if that was Heaney. It's just
Yeah,
occurred.
maybe.
I bet it was Heaney.
Oh.
Who else could it have been who was visiting Tor Balali?
Well, Obama hasn't slept there. I mean, he got the Peace Prize with it. Yeah, no, it had to have been. Why
Yeah.
wouldn't she have just that? Why
I
wouldn't she have just said Shane's like that?
think
Anyway,
I think it's an
cool.
Irish thing where they kind of bend out. They use a kind of bendy language where they often don't
Yeah.
name things directly. But anyway, that's a bit of that story. And afterwards, I met my dear friend Paul Kingsnorth was there. Uh, and we drank poachine. And at that point, he was part of a, I don't think he'll mind me saying, he was part of an Alexandrian coven who all came along, who were wonderful people who I remember terribly fondly. Uh, and then we all sort of danced till dawn, and that was it.
I was going to ask when you mentioned the Eastern Orthodox thing. I was going to. My mind went to Paul right away, so
Yeah.
we might get to it. I mean, yeah. Do you have him to blame, or is it
No, I don't.
was the Joni Sora
Paul,
thing?
Paul is innocent. Paul is innocent of that. It is interesting. I mean, it bears reflection. It bears reflection that too, because Paul and I are old friends and have known each other and admired each other's work for well over a decade. And we have certainly been in communication over the last few years because both of us were being led kicking and screaming in the direction of Christianity. So it was there's almost no other spiritual substrata that I thought I would be more, less attuned to than that. And then once I had enough encounters to realize that I really needed to take this seriously, and I was in contact with something that was utterly undomestic, uncorralled, and unspeakable in the amount of love it was giving out. I just had to surrender to it. But then, of course, you have the challenge of trying to find an institution or a church or a something that speaks to you with the kind of power, hopefully, that a river or a mountain or a forest does. And I have met now many, many wonderful, good hearted, rather like, actually, I think makes me think of the shy, good shire folk with big Christian hearts. And actually, I am painfully aware of the absolutely sort of corrupted legacy of many elements of Christianity, but not all.
Yeah.
And the struggle for me has been to find a place where my profoundly mystic sensibilities can rest in a kind of contemplative dimension of the mystery of Yeshua. And
Mm.
funnily enough, I found it. I just walked into a shopping mall in Exeter, and in the middle of the shopping mall was a little church they couldn't knock down because it's an Anglo-Saxon church. And I opened the door. I walked into something called the Divine Liturgy, and I had not been so profoundly ceremonially arrested since I was in a sweat lodge with a man called Wallace Black Elk 25 years ago, the grandson of Nicholas Black Elk, who wrote Black Elk Speaks. And so I've just gone back. It's just a profoundly good thing for me. I was always one of the things that used to alarm me about Jung was his emphasis on the possibility of a kind of wholeness. I was scared of wholeness. I was much more interested, as many of us are, in the notion of the trickster figure whose power is in his nose and the end of his tail, not a kind of I'm a Deleuze and Guattari guy, you know. I'm not. I'm interested in. My first book has loads of rhizomic stuff in it, so that was always the sort of approach. So you can see why shamanism worked. It absolutely worked for me. But as I got older, I was looking for, I know this is going to sound, and forgive me, anybody that's listening to this, because this isn't meant to be remotely trying to make anybody feel small or be advantageous. I needed a different kind of backbone. It couldn't always be ecstatic flight, because when ecstatic
Yeah.
flight is taken out of the culture that understands it, as you and many people listening, we have the struggle of putting ourselves back together afterwards. And for me, the divine liturgy, interestingly, is a kind of runway for the Holy Spirit to enter. But it's a very, very old, very repeated pattern. And so it is less chaotic than the Holy Spirit I was encountering in the charismatic movement of the early 80s. But I recognized the oxygen straight away. I just recognized the kind of patterning inside myself. So that's not an answer I'd give on many podcasts, Gordon. But
No, that's look.
yeah,
It's I'm really interested in the growth of Eastern Orthodoxy at the moment, and there's some really powerful magic in it. Like it's old enough that it was deliberately put together as actual ceremony. So Dr. Farrell talks about how if for baptism the priest will blow on the baptismal font, like breathe across it, and the idea being that you are bringing the baby or the person being baptized into resonance with that creation event. So all these things that we just don't, if you think about ecstatic American Christianity, where you just sort of declare yourself saved and maybe get dunked in a river or a bath or something. It's very different to the whole, no, that's hermetic. You're basically microcosm, macrocosming when you do that, right? So you can find, it's built on big magic. So it doesn't surprise me that it resonates with people who have a ceremonial understanding, because it's certainly in there, and it's still in there. Whereas in the intervening 1500 years, decisions were made for better and for worse in certain places that, and I kind of think today, if we want to, and I don't usually do, but if we summon martial metaphors, like if we go down the war front, the allies are the people on the side of the mythic as opposed to the denatured and technocratic. So it's kind of that's the preeminent theater between the technocratic and the alive, and the mythic is alive. So I generally think it's good when whoever it is finds um, the their place in the mythic, because that's good, because it means you're not you haven't wandered along into technocratic archonic hell. So for me, it's really appealing to see people resonate with the forms that they resonate with, I think.
yes, and you're reminding me of an alchemical phrase, "vas bene clausum," which means the well-sealed vessel. And over the years, you could imagine I have met, countless thousands of spiritual practitioners of one kind or another, from way out where the buses don't park to folks in church, and the vessel has so many cracks in it. I mean, like you, I'm sure I like the Leonard Cohen phrase about the cracks let in the light, but there's a limit. There's a ceremonial limit. So for me, I've hit something that is bigger, far more profound than my own little querying nature, which I'm invested and interested in. I like the way, I love to imagine, I love to inhabit this universe, but I'm just in touch with something now where I've been utterly leveled, utterly humbled. And yeah, that's a rare, wonderful commodity when, God willing, you're grizzled old middle aged guy.
Excellent. All right. So we might pick that back up once we talk about. I've decided I'm not going to call it Project Operation. So let's talk about the Bardskull operation.
Yeah.
And the next annoying question that people who write books get asked is, and I'm going to try and make it less annoying, but how did that originate? When did that sort of thought first land? And sort of explain to people this is an operation. Like there were restrictions and places and so on involved. So introduce people to that.
Okay, so we're referring to something that took place 3 to 3.5 years ago. The location is Dartmoor National Park within Devon in England. That is 375 square miles of what we in Britain could just about get away with calling wilderness. It's Dartmoor is interesting. It used to be the bottom of the ocean, used to be inhabited by hyenas and elephants and wolves and bears and lions. But there's a forest that I have a tremendous soft spot for called Holm Chase. And my father has been visiting it and his mother before him. So there's a family tradition. Now, about 3.5 years ago, I looked in my passport and believe it or not, I had toured America. I'd done 40 tours of duty as an active teacher, storyteller, ceremony man, let's call it. And I was exhausted by it. And I wanted to sort of draw a circle, really, of just a few miles around myself and to go into this particular forest for 101 days. And I did it actually through a bit of folklore, Gordon. I'd heard in a local pub that if you were bitten by a wolf, if you took yourself away and didn't leave the house for 101 days and wore only white and didn't think in pure thoughts, you could gradually diffuse the power of the wolf. Now, my second name, Shaw, Sithach means wolf. So I decided to go out into the woods for 101 days to reverse that ceremony. Because as I felt we're so denuded as a culture, we needed more fur, not less. You know, so I go out primarily to give thanks, and I just go out at dusk every day. It's very near the cottage I was living in, and I sit and I sit and I sit, and I did something called calling songs, which is really an old sort of Aboriginal idea you would find in the old bardic systems of Britain, where you are simply giving thanks, telling a story, finding 12 secret names for things, being a praise maker in the detritus of this world. You are aiming beauty consistently and markedly and specifically at a place, and the story develops from there. I must say, I had no clear ambition or even understanding that it was going to become a book as I was writing it. So there's actually, as you probably picked up on, I haven't done an enormous amount of tidying up as I go. I haven't put a load of bows through it. There are very few handrails. I just knew that it was the same time as the Extinction Rebellion stuff was really announcing itself in London, and Trafalgar Square was filled with people gluing their hands to the lions and all of that kind of thing. And there were certain requests that I might consider being something of a spokesman for that. But in that time of climate emergency, I thought, well, is anybody of my pigment at least actually going out and listening to the woods? What do the woods have to say about this? Is this the end times? What does it have to say? Maybe if I gave it gifts day after day, something would happen. And Bardskull is the account of this, what proved to be a kind of disintegration where the human imagination, and this is almost like this is almost like Henri Corbin, if you've read him and Islamic cosmology. There's a place where the human imagination runs out of road and it hits all kinds of angelic confluences and all sorts of elemental patternings. This is not new information, I understand. And then beyond that, something really significant can happen. And that's what ended up happening to me in Bardskull. And it's interesting to me now that people are talking about Bardskull as a wonderful act of autofiction, as if I sat in a cafe in Hoxton, supping a flat white, writing it up. Most of what I wrote about happened, and
Yeah.
so yeah, yeah.
No, you can tell. The reason I mentioned Italo Calvino is that as I was reading it. So in the tarot course, the recommended reading was Castle of Cross Destinies, which is in the members area. We did a tarot course a few years ago, and when we do another one, which we will, something like this will be the recommended reading because that edge, I mean, we can use Jungian terms, but that the encounter with the more than human at the edge of the imaginal is evident to me in there. That's why I mentioned the Red Book as another sort of reference. These, it's plainly, I think the people who suggested it, or who assumed that it was written in a cafe in Hoxton, are the same people who thought Lord of the Rings was like a post-nuclear apocalypse survival story when they first read it, because because it didn't, when it came out, because it didn't compute what it actually was for them. So I really, when did you know though? So when did you know that this operation had attracted these beings, and you're like, oh, I guess I'm going to go a bit mad for the next 101 days
Yeah.
and see where this goes? Like, was there, did that happen at the beginning? Was there I might go a bit mad doing this, or did you get a bit of the way in and the universe starts to respond and you're like, well, guess I'm going mad for the next 101 days?
Yeah, yeah. I'd um I'd read it. I remember there was a book, there was an account, a diary, I think in the 70s. I think it's called something like A Magician's Diary, of a guy that attempted one of those 6-month-esque Aleister Crowley spells. Maybe if it wasn't at Boleskillen, it was somewhere like that. And I just thought, what an interesting idea, kind of an account of becoming invisible, very, very slowly. But then I forgot all about it. But now, of course, when I reflect on it, especially early on in the story, I realized that I was being stalked by someone who I couldn't quite see up on the hill. And I crawl into the belly of a horse at a certain point, and things like that were just rushing through me. I didn't really know what was going on, but I as a veteran of many wilderness vigils and much time in the understory of the kind of what they used to call the matter of Britain, the consciousness, the strange, gnarly, weird of Britain. I trusted enough to go with it, because although I've encountered tremendous phenomena, spirits, otherly, all kinds of otherly dimensions out in the bush, not once have I come across anything that really had the tang of something profoundly evil or didn't wish me well. But over the years, I've learned to discern. You can still be shit scared when you're in the presence of the holy. Of course you can, because you've entered a kind of taboo. All the hairs are going up on the back of your neck because something is about to announce itself to you that is simply beyond your. It's not your imagination at this point. Something has stepped forward, and your whole consciousness has to reconfigure to accommodate it. So, to be honest, that kind of thing is happening in the latter third of the book. And then suddenly, this kind of redemptive energy started to come through. I had an encounter at uh, believe it or not, I was up there one night, and in the middle of the night, something just fell out of the sky and landed next to me. And if you find it in the book, and even if people want to know that story, you can probably find it on YouTube. I literally don't have the energy to describe it at this moment. It's too Wacken. It's too holy. But you're by this point. I was I was so far beyond anywhere I'd ever been before. I was just sort of hanging on. The only thing I can say though is I certainly wasn't unhappy, and I as someone, I'm very familiar with visionary vines and visionary vegetables and all of that kind of thing. This has no ingestion of anything like that within it. The encounter that I just described happened when I wandered up to the forest. Amazing, I'd had a belly full of food, I'd had a cup of tea. I was quite pleased to move this experience along. It'd been a long time. It was day 101 in the forest. And in the middle of it, I just suddenly saw these 9 words that said, inhabit the time and genesis of your original home. Inhabit the time and genesis of your original home. And to cut a very long, interesting story short, in the end, that for me was it was a returning to this strange, turbulent, burning wheel of a being called Yeshua, this Galilee druid. The last thing I ever expected to encounter in a forest was that being, but I did. So I am now, I'm now happily following it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the clue is in the word Genesis, right? That when you get those sort of things, you go, okay, you're encountering the mythic when it comes through with language, which it often does. It's going to have levels. It's going to be which of the words, how, you've encountered something real if it works on at least 3 levels, and that was kind of one of them. But that's cool. I really like that. So you mentioned last name Wolf. The wolf motif, not just in this book, has been there in previous works as well.
Mm.
I mean, again, it's an annoying question, but I want to see where you go with it. Why? Why is the wolf
I,
archetype, let's just say being, so alive for you?
I, I don't know. I don't know. I avoid, again, whenever I have a dream, if I see a snake in the dream, I don't wake up and say the snake is my mother. I just let
Yeah,
it
sure.
be a snake. I keep things as images for as long as I possibly can. So for some reason, I'm drawn to the wolf. And you're right, though. I mean, there's another book I wrote called Wolf Milk, which comes actually a story from the Caucasus, which is the Caucasus, by the way, for anybody that's interested in myth. There's a set of mythologies from the Caucasus called the Nart sagas. And most people have never heard of the Nart sagas, but they are as phenomenal as the Greek, anything within Greek myth or Russian fairy tales. The Nart sagas are a real place to go, especially John Colaruso's translations. But they talk about wolf milk as something young men needing to drink the young men needing to drink the milk of wolves to become men. And there's just something sort of appealing in the strangeness of wolf milk in me. And of course, if you are literally named it and it's in the the braided knot of your second name, that's going to be moving around in me too, I think.
Yeah. I'm really interested in it being wolf rather than wolf archetype, and so on. I wrote an intro for a book that I think is out now, if not soon, called White Deer, where if you look at how to say this right, if you look at non-Western, at least for the last 300 years, cosmologies, and I think of, say, Aboriginal ones, where creation stories where emu births the sun, it's not the emu goddess, it's just emu. And the same thing happens when you get to Aztec mythology, where the creation of Teotihuacan, or Tenochtitlan rather, it's just jaguar and rabbit. It's not the jaguar god, it's not rabbit god. They're just, and I know this from colonial encounters. Indigenous people would be very confused by our denaturing, and like, what are you talking about? Like, these beings have a multidimensionality to them that includes a physical expression, but not, and they don't force them to fit into frameworks that are built for our convenience. And that's kind of what I like about how wolf shows up for you, is that, well, it's not a wolf god,
Mm.
it's wolf.
Right. As soon as you say goddess of the river and not river goddess or just river, this
Yeah.
distancing, this very weird Western distancing process has begun. I mean, I've had a lovely something that was useful for me within the creation of Bardskull, or the receiving of Bardskull, was the realization on these walks I was taking that there would have been a time where every bend in the river had a deity attached, and they would be more useful to you than a postcode. Every place has a sort of, a spiritual zip code, and if you were going to move from one side of Dartmoor to the other, you'd need to understand the specific, libations of that particular zip code, that particular bend in the river as you moved past it. Before Bardskull, there was a big book I wrote called Scatterlings about 6 years ago, getting claimed in the age of amnesia. And that is a book with a few more handrails in it than Bardskull, but it's really the same process, which I encourage everyone to have a crack at, which is just draw effectively a metaphysical chalk circle of about 15 miles around where you live, and say all teachers come from this place for me for say 12 months, and just see what happens. See what roams towards you.
Yeah, that's very cool. The final bit, I quite liked where Wolf went in one particular place in the book, uh, like changing the name of Doggerland to Wolferland. I thought was a really, really nice idea, because I've always been really, really haunted by, well, not always, but since we've known about Doggerland, I guess, been quite haunted by. So I'm very interested in Atlantis and Numenor and places that sink, and that kind of came through in the book, as well as uh, I even wrote it down. Where is it? Like, where everything you loved disappeared. Like, as there's something. I didn't realize that's one of the things that was so alive for me about Atlantis or Numenor or Doggerland, or wherever. It does have that um, teachable horror, the teachable horror, that inevitable loss. But that was, I thought, quite powerful. But I mean, yeah, how had you done much thinking with Doggerland and Wolferland before the book, or did that
No,
come through
none.
with Bard?
None. There's a figure in the book that started to arrive after about 2 months into this, who is my genuine great great uncle, who was a man called Hamer Broadbent. And Hamer Broadbent was a Plymouth Brethren missionary who, in the early 1900s, found his way to extraordinary places like Siberia and Transylvania and the Baltics, and even sort of up in the Arctic regions. And interestingly, rather than spending any real time trying to convert anybody, he spent all his time trying to protect local people from what he called priestcraft, which was kind of corrupted versions of Christianity at that point in Eastern Europe and Siberia. So Hamer Broadbent starts to turn up in my dreams, starts to turn up as a presence. And it turns out, believe it or not, in real life, Hamer was bitten by a wolf. There's a book that I found once this was happening to me called Hamer Broadbent, Pilgrim and Saint. You would find it on, your local, you could Google it. And it turns out that he was bit by a wolf, walking between two villages, two of them actually. They came out of the woods and bit him. So he ends up really priming me in the nobility of being bitten, the kind of the pharmacon element of being bitten, the poison, but also the remedy. And it's he that starts walking back and forth to me every night across Doggerland to bring back these stories so there's a kind of strange interaction going on between very local Devonian stories and stories from the very edge of the world. Now, people don't like it when I do that. and they say, well, you shouldn't tell a Siberian story. But the reality is, when the world is on fire, everything is shouting to everything else as the ship goes down. And I'm in touch with, many Indigenous people. And I've always said to them, if you don't want me to tell the story, don't tell it. But how's this as an arrangement? I'll send money to your community every time that story gets told. And if you change your mind, not a word will come from my lips. But in the meantime, I will put money into Indigenous programs that help, local kids rediscover these stories, rediscover that culture. So I'm just preempting a bit of what I might get for even telling a Siberian story in that book. But what was happening in my journey in Bardskull was that Hamer Broadbent was bringing them back night after night across Doggerland, because these were the stories he heard when he was moving about 120 years ago.
Amazing. Yeah. I really like that it works with Bardskull and it works with Dartmoor as a seafloor and so on. And
Yeah.
what I, it's funny how these kind of things rhyme, right? Like I didn't actually realize, so you mentioned in the book that Doggerland was rediscovered or encountered when fishermen brought a harpoon, like an elkhorn, I believe it was, whatever it was, harpoon up in their fishing nets, presumably in the channel. I don't know where. And Maui shit. And I read that in New Zealand, and Maui actually lifts up New Zealand with a fishing hook. Like the creator being there. So I was sort of on an island that had been lifted up by this hook that was emerged from the sea. It was one of those weird, like, oh wow, that's a thing that rhymes. It's again, I don't want to use the word archetype. It's something about like fishing up a sunken land to live in, and it was just one of those kind of moments of goodness. That's yeah, I'll sit with that. It's one of the things. It's an example, I guess, of uh, a medicine you can't describe. Like there was something in that for me that I now can't tell you, but it had a kind of reality to it that I think was important, particularly because I'm really struck by the idea of Doggerland and how we understand that kind of archaic time, given that you could, walk to Denmark. Presumably you had, cousins there. It's fascinating, right? So
Isn't it? Isn't it?
anyway,
I mean, the note, of course, that for example, as you know, Ireland and mainland Britain were once one. It was a long time ago, but they were one. But everybody we now recognise as Irish kind of comes from the Basque country, and on and on and on. I don't know. Have you ever come across the scholarship around the notion that a lot of the Arthurian stuff comes from this place I previously mentioned, the Caucasus?
no, I haven't, but I actually wanted to talk to you about. Uh, this is interesting because when Merlin shows up, he kind of has a almost catty aside about Gandalf, which is fine because Merlin isn't Gandalf. But
Yeah.
I one of the things that I think, and maybe it was his time, but one of the things that I think Tolkien didn't get quite right was uh, more or not quite dismissing the Arthurian saga as being a French import. Um, but that's also that's uncharitable because there's a wildness to it, particularly with Merlin. But in general, the story is eerie and older, and kind of belongs to the land in a way that I think he should have paid more attention to.
I I
but
couldn't agree more.
that comes through at Bardskull. Yeah.
Tolkien said something along the lines, now this is a misquote, and some of your listeners will know it, so forgive me. He said something along the lines of Celtic myth in general is like rather beautiful stained glass windows who someone's lobbed stones through. So you can't quite make the images up again. I refute that to my bones. And as someone that can tell Celtic stories for many days, not just an hour, he's wrong about that. And he's so wonderful at what he does, and he's so accomplished, and I'm so tremendously grateful for Tolkien. But on this one issue, I absolutely disagree with him. Because actually, for if you have an artistic temperament, those holes that he is so critical of is wonderful for your own imagination to flood into and work like a bricoleur. It's an act of bricolage to take one thing and then another. And that's part of the genius of the Irish mind, actually. Those stories are the Irish Old Testament.
Yeah.
That's what they are. They're the Irish Old Testament to those people. So I take them tremendously seriously and I love them, but they are playful and curvaceous like an Irish landscape, not like this wonderful Wagnerian northernness that Tolkien
Yeah.
and Lewis and others are so great at. Uh, so thank you for pointing that out, because actually if anyone is interested in particularly the older Arthurian tradition, so we're getting into the Welsh material, look at a book that I did called Cinderbiter, which is it's anonymous Irish poems and stories from roughly 1,000 to 1,500 years ago, very influenced by Kenneth Hurlston Jackson's book, A Celtic Miscellany, which everybody must have. But Jackson's translations are like birds that need to be released from their cages. They're very accurate, but there's not a lot of music in them. But no, anyway, rant over.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was really good because my first ever tarot deck was an Arthurian one. There were sort of stories that raised me in regional Australia, so it was nice to see them alive. I get it. I mean, I have this take on Tolkien that uh, he wouldn't have been able to do what he did had he not been captured by a kind of North Saxon thing. Right? If his interests were more varied, he wouldn't have been able to bring through what he did. But unfortunately, it does mean that there is this error. There's this error in his thinking, which I guess would have been a necessary one, because if he fell in love with that, we wouldn't have got, I don't think, because Middle Earth was a lifelong project. We wouldn't have got what we got without it.
It was.
So, but it was really, it was funny because Merlin, Gandalf, it's just self-evident to me, even if you want to use the word archetype, are different. And it was really fun to encounter that, first of all, in the book. Like, Gandalf's a foreigner in the best possible way. Like, Gandalf's Odin, at least Gandalf the Grey is. Merlin is, um, it's couldn't more Welsh than St. David. It's just, it couldn't be. And it's especially because the Merlin that I encounter more is that, honestly, a Bardskull one, like a crazy wilderness one, when he's either gone insane from heartbreak, or he's trapped in a cave, or living in the woods. But it's far wilder than Gandalf lived in the wild, but wasn't actually wild. He was like an angel walking around the world. So it's a different being. So it was really fun towards the beginning of the book to be, I'm gonna like where this goes, because you're encountering forms, I guess, that
Yes.
have stringent opinions.
Yeah, very well put. That's it, stringent opinions.
Yeah, cool. So, how this is going to be? I guess the book is recently released, so you've had some time to think about it. How do you describe it to someone? So, what's your latest book, Martin? Oh, Bardskull. Okay, what's that about? How do you? It's so Courting the Wild Twin, which I loved. Easy to describe.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the clue is literally in the title. No, do you know, you meet me just before that particular onslaught is about to begin. So whilst I can't produce anything off the tip of the tongue this evening, within a few days I will have to have at least a few keys that open the door of the encounter. But it's a book, to be honest. I'm very, very, very pleased that Bardskull happened. However, now you can imagine Gordon as a writer, if the chances of me ever being able to get back there again are
Totally.
slim. It's a bit
Yeah.
like it's a back of the wardrobe kind of thing. It's like I just
Yeah.
what goes on in that book. The price paid, the degree of luck attached, where it's taken me since. I don't know. So to be honest, at the moment, I'm almost speechless. The thing that I'll have to do is just start reading from it. I know I'm touring Canada actually in the first 2 weeks of May. I'm going all the way from uh, Nova Scotia to Vancouver, which is like going from Devon to Moscow. It's a long way. And I will hope to read from Bardskull every night. So by then, I have to have something coherent to say about it. But at the moment, um, I don't know what to say. Even my publisher, who loves it, a guy called John Mitchinson, says I just don't know what this is. That's why he took it on. Yeah.
I really I I don't know who laid it out, but
Mm,
I'm daunted in retrospect by the prospect of having to lay it out, because
mm,
that's a key component of making. You say there's no handrails.
mm.
Uh, there's one, maybe. It's whoever had to lay that out did a really good job of retaining the power of the moment that's in it. So, but I lay out books not often, but I have done it, and I looked at that and I'm like, nope. That
Yeah.
was, yeah, it's, which I really appreciate. I really appreciate the amount of thought and effort that the publisher has put into making. I don't even want to call it a challenging text. It's more that it would have been challenging for them.
Mm.
It's actually, it's as challenging as going down a slide. It's, that it has an increasing like kinesis to it, but it's not challenging in the sense of, oh, this is going to be difficult to read. It's the opposite. It's you can't put it down, because not in a page turning summer novel sense, but there's too much momentum once you start. So I'm really happy with the form and the shape of it. But yeah, I don't know quite how to describe it. I'm going to say Italo Calvino does Fear and Loathing, because it's a mythologist and poet. I can say it. You can't, encountering the more than human in a specific and charged place over a period of time. So it's one of those kind of books. And I think that's really, it's really compelling. It's really good work. Well
Thank
done.
you. Thank you, Gordon. Well, if you give me permission, I'll send that wonderful quote of yours to the publishers, because that I
Go
just think,
for it.
thank you. I think that would be really, really good. And I also want to take this moment to praise your work, because I'd been reading you. We'd met briefly, and I hadn't realised you were the same Gordon of whose books you're doing a tremendous service to the world at this moment. You have a great mind. It's tremendously imaginative, but it's also unself-consciously scholarly, like in the very best sense. It's a real compliment to you. And I hope you live for 300 years at least. And I hope you just keep deepening into what you're doing, because it's terrific stuff, man.
All right. I'll see you at your 311th and my 300th, or whatever it is.
Yes, yes. I'll bring the
Well,
fireworks.
funny enough, like now that my numbers start with a 4, which was what I finished with that, it's really fun. I don't encounter, maybe I haven't looked for them, but I don't encounter books about that capture the horror and concern about male aging. And there's a whole bunch of that in Bardskull, because it's like the inside of the skull of a bard. I mean, I get it,
Yeah.
and it was really like, whoa, in a powerful, like, yes.
Mm.
I see all of that, and funny, I'm not surprised that Merlin came through so early in the book, because that's always been a big part of his charge for me, is that Merlin fails where men of a certain age always fail, which is to be ridiculous when it comes to, like, love. And I thought it was really deep and powerful stuff in that ride. So yeah, well done.
Thank you. There's also a character in it called Voinamoinen, this sort of Finnish shaman as well. And he gets into all sorts of, he's also, beleaguered and upset and all of that stuff. Yeah, it was, and it was all real, that health stuff, and it remains so. It's just part of the terrific indignity of aging. And it's funny, isn't it? I don't know. I mean, are you 40?
I turned 42 in June. I had
Okay.
to remember that. Yeah.
It'll be
Yeah.
interesting. I would imagine there are days when you think you're 27, and there are days when you think you're about
Okay.
98. And I sort of swing frantically
Yeah.
between the two, at the worst possible moments. But
Yeah, and
yeah,
it's such a, yeah, it's a strange, like the Merlin. I don't want to say archetype. The medicine or the shape of what happens to him in some of the stories about getting old and being an old fool. And I last week or the week before, I had Dr. Rosita Arvigo on. She wrote a student she studied under Don Eligio, who was like basically the shaman of Central America, and studied with him when he was 93, no, 91 until he died at 103. And his wife had died. And there's a part in the book during her apprenticeship where he falls in love with a woman who's 30 or 40, like she's in her 50s, but he's in his 90s, right? And she takes advantage of him and takes all his money and so on. And she tried to tell him at the time, like, this is not what you think it is. But I thought of Merlin then, and then reading your book, that there's a warning. There's a warning in Merlin's story for that kind of stuff. It
there
was
are.
really interesting to see that grappled with,
Do you know much about the very late stages of Robert Graves' life?
I do
He
not.
he just played that out writ large. It was just sort of awful. Graves is huge for me as a figure. He's absolutely massive. Even and I mention it in Bardskull actually. I'm like, the White Goddess doesn't work, but it fucking does work all at the
No,
same time. I
Defense
can't,
of White Goddess. We didn't get to it.
yeah,
I,
that
I, I
was,
like I
yeah.
like defending stuff that's unfashionable, that still has charge, that still has energy, and to see a defense of White Goddess, I'm like, well done.
Thank you. Yeah, I did. I was cool. I remember saying, for everyone that's rude about the White Goddess, I'm calling you a snob and a child, and I hope your mother goes and packs your fucking sandwiches and you fuck off somewhere else. You know, excuse my French, but yeah, no. Some books are about magic and some books are magic. And Graves, for me, in some peculiar way, he pulls it off with the White Goddess, even if his scholarship is bonkers and doesn't stand up. I'm not coming to him for that. I'm not coming
No,
to
exactly. It's
him.
not what it is.
No,
Yeah.
but anyway,
Anyway,
my point was sadly at the end, yeah, there were women coming in and out of Graves's life that and the blame less rests with him, not with them particularly, but they just performed this ceremonial function of bleeding him dry. It's kind of ghastly. Yeah.
yeah. Hey, this is the risk, and I'm sure you've thought about it, and it kind of happened with Bardskull. There's a reason magicians have magic circles, and why a big part of all shamanic practice is protection and so on, because these beings, if you tangle with myth, it tangles with you, and you can get caught in its shape. That's what we do.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
there is. It's interesting. I mean, people say to me sometimes, as someone, I'm famous for telling long, difficult, painful love myths like Tristan and Isolde, or The Pursuit of Dermot and Grania, or others. And they say, "Do you think that telling that story then created that encounter immediately in your life?" And I said, "Well, it's not. It's not. It's not quite as simple as that. It's as if the things are simpatico to each other. And when something is playing itself out within you already, what is inevitably going to turn up is a mirror of that. So
Exactly.
I'm not so superstitious that I wouldn't tell the truth, because otherwise you just tell stories about people becoming rich all the time, and you know it's and falling in love or whatever. You've got to deal with the dark materials. We should probably end soon, but my final thought for me is I'm very interested in not giving up on the word romanticism, but I'm interested in what they used when they described Owen Barfield. Now, Owen Barfield used to describe Steiner, who's someone that I don't really care for, but they always said about Steiner that he was romanticism come of age. Now, I'm really interested as a kind of cultural question to all of us that are stewed in romanticism, and you and I certainly are. Um, what would a romanticism come of age look like? It's going to have the under. It's going to have. It can't be the kind of romanticism where you peter out at 27. It's got to have that underworld thing in it. Maybe we could come back together in a year's time and talk
Well,
about
that's a good idea. Yeah. At least by our 300th birthday, we will have sorted it out.
exactly.
Well, all right. So thank you very much. This was a fantastic discussion. For people who want to know more about the book and what else you got going on, all of that kind of stuff, where do they go to find out more?
I would suggest the easiest thing is schoolofmyth.com. We're just about to celebrate our 20th anniversary, which will begin in September. 5 weekends. You come and study with me. People come from all over the place. They're often, if people are traveling internationally, they're often interested in doing some work in Britain anyway. So they tend to come over and everyone becomes friends. I have a limit of about 60 students a go. So to some people, that'll seem like a huge group, but it's not actually in comparison to what we could do. So look at schoolofmyth.com, but also go to something called Sister Mystica, small c, Sister Mystica, and that's the name of my small press. And I'm very interested in alchemical, magical, romantic, rites of passage, wilderness type of stuff, and that's where all my books go. That a lot of the books that I write, the stuff that is going to be sort of limited interest but super deep, that's where you're going to find it.
Right. Well, yeah. Once again, congratulations! Fantastic ride of a book, and a brilliant chat.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gordon.